As I said, we're very pleased to have my colleague and friend Paul Appelbaum with us. Paul, as many of you know, is the Dollar Professor of... They all know. The Dollar Professor of Psychiatry, Medicine, and Law at Columbia University. He's also one of the, I think, world's leading experts in bioethics, and particularly bioethics and psychiatry. And there's a wide number of mental health issues that raise ethical and legal questions that many of us deal with. He is the head of the Center of Excellence in Ethical, Legal, Social Implications of Research on Psychiatric, Neurological, and Behavioral Conditions. Conditions, isn't it?
Genetics.
Otherwise known as brain genetics. And he has, as many of you also know, coined the term therapeutic misconception, which has been an extremely useful and important concept for all of us who are involved in research in any way. He's written many, many articles, books, has been in the media on numerous occasions, and we are delighted and honored to have you with us today. So please join me in welcoming him.
So thank you, Bob. I feel a certain asymmetry since you're all over there and I'm over here, but I need to control the slide. So be it. If you're interested in moving over this way, that would be fine. So Bob, thank you for inviting me to join you all here this evening. I always get a kick out of coming back into Hamilton Hall. I was an undergraduate here at Columbia just a couple of years ago, and spent a lot of time in this building, and it's fun every time I walk back in. What I'm going to be talking about today, as you know, are research ethics and where they came from, as it were, and where they're likely to be going in the foreseeable future. I would invite you, as I'm going through this, to stop me as I go along if there are questions you have or comments that you want to make. There'll be time at the end for additional questions, but I'd rather deal with things as we go along. If I'm going to get to it later on, I'll tell you that I'll get to it later on, but otherwise we'll just deal with them as you have them and minimize the risk of your not remembering at the end. So essentially, there are two sets of issues we're going to address. One is the history of regulation of research and the implementation of ethical approaches to human subjects research. In particular, informed consent, because so much of ethical regulation focuses on informed consent, and because it's a particular interest of mine, but we'll talk about research regulation more broadly, and then we'll talk a little bit about where research ethics are heading, just focused on a few selected issues, and then we'll have time for discussion. So the ethics of research do not precede the beginning of medical research itself, which is, in the history of the world, a relatively recent phenomenon. The first clinical trial, if you will, occurred in 1747, just 7 years before this university was founded. And it took place in England. It was Lynn's study of scurvy among British sailors, and it was done in a fairly classical controlled fashion. That is, Lynn equipped some ships in the British Navy where scurvy was a major issue as the Navy was sailing around the world with limes that the sailors, who later acquired the nickname of limeys, could get juice from during the course of the voyage. And other ships did not have such possibilities, such opportunities, and he studied the differential rate of scurvy in under those two conditions, and established that there was something in citrus that prevented the development of scurvy. Interestingly, it took about another 50 years before the British Navy universalized the requirement that citrus fruits and citrus juice be carried on its ships, and it was another 50 years before scurvy was eliminated from the British Navy. Another early example of research comes from Pierre Louis' studies in Paris in the 1820s, published in the 1830s, of bloodletting as a treatment for, in particular, pneumonia. There was a belief in the early 19th century, an old belief, that pneumonia represented a congestion of the lungs, not far off from reality, but that the way to treat it would be to remove blood from the body, sever a vein, and take out a pint or two of blood in order to reduce the blood volume and therefore reduce the congestion. Louis was a little bit skeptical about this received wisdom and decided to essentially randomize his patients into those who came in with pneumonia and had bloodletting and those who didn't. By the end of his study, he'd established fairly conclusively that bloodletting was more likely to lead to death in patients with pneumonia than not taking blood from them, and that changed the treatment of pneumonia. We still didn't have effective treatments for another century beyond that, when the antibiotics in the 1930s, streptomycin, are first introduced. And later in the 19th century, we see the pace of clinical trials accelerate. Lots of studies of nutritional diseases. I can tell you the story of Beriberi in the Japanese Navy. Very similar story to what went on in the British Navy with scurvy, and infectious diseases as well. However, in none of these studies, as far as we know, was consent obtained from the research subjects. Indeed, in Lynn's study and Pierre Louis' bloodletting studies, it seems fairly clear that the subjects of the research had no idea that they were subjects of research. They went into the doctor, in Louis' case, and he did what he was going to do. Either he took blood from them or he didn't. They didn't have the choice, and they were unaware that he was testing a medical hypothesis. There were some leading physicians by the late 19th century, William Osler, the father of modern medicine, one of them, who are on record as urging that consent be obtained from human subjects, although they weren't then conceptualized as human subjects. But it is pretty clear that that was rarely done. The first governmental regulations come not in the United States, but in Prussia in the 1890s. This is after German unification, so this is a Prussian state statute, not a German national statute, which was implemented after patients in Prussian hospitals, as part of some experiment of some sort, were inoculated with syphilis, deliberately and without their knowledge. And syphilis, of course, in the 1890s had no treatment. When that became public, there was an uproar, and Prussia introduced regulations requiring patient consent before they could be entered into clinical studies. The first known consent form that is extant comes from Colonel Walter Reed's studies of yellow fever in Cuba during and after the Spanish-American War. Reed used a combination of American soldiers and Cuban civilians as his research subjects, exposed some of them to the bedding of people who had had yellow fever, since there was a hypothesis that that was how yellow fever was transmitted. That was how smallpox was transmitted. Why not yellow fever? And some of them to the bite of the Anopheles mosquito, which it turned out, in fact, was the vector that transmitted yellow fever. The consent form, which you can track down online, was 1 page long, a model of concision, and pretty much told the subjects everything they needed to know about what would happen to them and about the incentives for participation. They were offered $100 in gold for participating in the mosquito bite part of the study. And if they contracted and died from yellow fever, their families would get $200 in gold. And in many respects, as primitive as Walter Reed's approach seems today, it really was way ahead of its time in terms of respect for the subjects who were entering his study, and clear communication of what a study was about, what the procedures were that were involved, and what the risks of participation were. It was clear to everybody that they could die. Bob?
What made Walter Reed do that, which was sort of revolutionary in its time?
Yeah, so, the records are not complete. It is clear, as I understand it, that the War Department in Washington was very concerned about American public reaction to the use, not of Cuban civilians, but of American soldiers in these studies. And if it was to be the case that they were to be involved, then it had to be on a strictly voluntary basis, with some sort of compensation, and with a clear understanding of what they were letting themselves in for. It's not clear that the War Department required a consent form per se, but with those restrictions, it's undoubtedly seemed logical to Reed to embody that in a written document and have them sign it, which they did. Yeah.
Is the documentation clear that the patients actually understood the form, or just that we know that there was a written form that said what the procedures were, simply that Cuban civilians actually understood what they were signing?
Yeah, it's not clear today that people who enter into research studies actually understand what they're signing. So we have no idea what they understood back then. Although the form, if you read it today, it is quite clear. There's not a lot of jargon. You could die. If you die, your family gets $200. It was written without the legal and medical gobbledygook that is so prevalent in our consent forms today. The Spanish-speaking Cuban civilians, that, all bets are off. I have no idea really what they were able to understand. Ironically, the next notable step in the evolution of regulation of research comes in Germany in 1931, about a year and a half before the Nazi takeover. Germany passes a law, this is Weimar Germany, passes a statute requiring that patient subjects receive explanations of experimental or innovative treatments. And in the regulatory mind, experimental and innovative were often linked, even though today we would consider them to be quite different. An innovation is not necessarily part of an experiment. It could be, a surgeon who decides he's got a better way to tie a knot, or a better approach, a better incision to use for a particular operation, which surgeons continue to do to this day. Experimental treatments imply some sort of systematic effort to assess whether something is effective. As an example of just how early, though, consent to research and the importance of consent to research reach the popular mind, I want to offer you an example from George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, which was written in the first decade of the 20th century and later becomes the play and the movie My Fair Lady. I'm going to share some dialogue with you that is almost the same, almost identical in Pygmalion and in My Fair Lady. Much of My Fair Lady, much of the dialogue is taken verbatim from Shaw's dialogue. And for those of you who know the play, Liza Doolittle, the flower girl at Covent Garden, has been approached by Henry Higgins, who is a linguist, professor of linguistics, and she agrees, or she comes to his house seeking his help for turning her into a lady, somebody who can speak the way a lady would speak, and he tells her that he's willing to do it. But Higgins has a friend, Colonel Pickering, who's quite worried about Eliza really understanding what it is she's getting into. So he pipes up and says, "Excuse me, Higgins, I really must interfere. If this girl is to put herself in your hands for 6 months for an experiment in teaching, she must understand thoroughly what she's doing." Higgins, how can she? She's incapable of understanding anything. Besides, do any of us understand what we're doing? If we did, would we ever do it? I can't tell you how many investigators today I hear some variant of that response from. Pickering, very clever, Higgins, but not sound sense. Higgins, no use explaining. As a military man, Pickering, you ought to know that. Give her her orders. That's what she wants. However, Eliza, you're to live here for the next 6 months, learning how to speak beautifully, like a lady in a florist's shop. If you're good and do whatever you're told, you shall sleep in a proper bedroom and have lots to eat and money to buy chocolates and take rides in taxis. This is a little dated. This is when it was a pleasure to take a ride in a taxi. If you're naughty and idle, you will sleep in the back kitchen among the black beetles and be walloped by Mrs. Pierce with a broomstick. At the end of 6 months, you shall go to Buckingham Palace in a carriage, beautifully dressed. If the king finds out you're not a lady, you will be taken by the police to the Tower of London, where your head will be cut off, as a warning to other presumptuous flower girls. If you're not found out, you shall have a present of 7 and 6pence to start life with as a lady in a shop. If you refuse this offer, you will be a most ungrateful and wicked girl, and the angels will weep for you. Now, are you satisfied, Pickering? So interestingly, this dialogue here contains all 3 of the essential elements of informed consent as we conceptualize it today. Pickering's concern is that Liza be told what's going to happen to her. Higgins' response focuses on her competence or capacity to understand or more appreciate that information. And Liza has her own bottom line here. You're a big bully, you are. I won't stay here if I don't like. I won't let nobody wallop me. So voluntariness is really what she's focusing on. I'll do it if I want to, but when I'm done, I'm out of here, and there's no way you can keep me. By the way, Higgins is right. Neither Liza nor, as it turns out, Henry Higgins himself can truly appreciate what the consequences of this little experiment are going to be. But despite the popular view embodied in Shaw's play, it's clear that in the period leading up to World War II, research studies were frequently, in fact, probably almost always conducted without the knowledge or consent of the participants, particularly in clinical settings. What changes everything is what goes on in the Nazi death camps in World War II. And that comes out to world attention in the Nuremberg doctors' trials after the war. The doctors were the first of the Nazis to be tried, even before the Nazi leaders, surviving leaders, are put on trial. The doctors' trial takes place beginning in 1946. In fact, if you read accounts of the trials themselves, Nuremberg wasn't even fully pacified at that point. There were saboteurs and snipers, unreconstructed Nazis, still roaming around the city and blowing things up. But the doctors were on trial for atrocities that they committed in the death camps in studies of unwilling subjects who were clearly being used without their consent. And the studies were pretty horrendous. To give you a couple of examples, there were the Gangrene Studies, where an incision was made in a limb of an individual, which was then rubbed with dirt and glass beads. The glass beads were there to make sure that the wound couldn't heal effectively. And the natural history of the development of gangrene was then observed until the person died. Not that we didn't know what the natural history of gangrene was, but there you go. There were also the experiments in attempting to reattach severed limbs, in which first, of course, limbs had to be severed. Turns out Nazi doctors didn't know how to reattach severed limbs, and most of those people died as well. There are horrendous pictures of dumpsters full of limbs, severed limbs. I could go on, but you get the idea. The tribunal, the International Panel of Judges, were pretty horrified by what they heard. And as part of their decision in the doctor's trial, produced a 10-point document, which is to this day known as the Nuremberg Code. The first principle of which is the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Now, it turns out, of course, today the voluntary consent of the human subject is not absolutely essential. We can talk about that as well. But in reaction to what they heard going on in the death camps, this seemed to them like an unassailable principle. Yeah.
Well, it occurs to me that early in the 20th century, we started to see a movement for the right to refuse treatment and the right to consent to treatment with Schlondorf and other early right to refuse cases, or at least right to know. How come that movement didn't make it into the research?
So that's a great question. In fact, you're a little early, not for Schlondorf, because that's in the 20s, but Schlondorf is an anomalous case that really begins to have impact only after the later informed consent cases come along, and they're looking for some sort of precedent. Schlondorf had almost no impact when it was actually decided. So let's hold that, because you'll see where they do come in. That does come in, but not quite yet. Happens in the 1950s. And the Nuremberg Tribunal had its view as to what should be disclosed to research subjects. Before the acceptance of an affirmative decision by the subject, there should be made known to him the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment, the method and means by which it's to be conducted, all inconveniences and hazards reasonably to be expected, and the effects upon his health or person which may possibly come from his participation in the experiment. And that's not a bad statement of what even today, as you'll see, we focus on in obtaining consent from research subjects. Yes?
Under whose authority were these doctors tried?
Oh, that's a complicated question of international law. Nuremberg made things up as it went along. Because there was no pre-existing body of international law. And so the victors in World War II created a tribunal and some basic procedures that were to be followed. It gave rise subsequently to a body of international law which has developed a good deal since that time. But this is where the notion of crimes against humanity comes from as a basis for supranational action. And the International Criminal Court in The Hague today, which is looking at murders in Kenya and massacres and genocide in Rwanda and killings in Bosnia, draws its inspiration and original model from the Nuremberg Tribunal. A more complex question, which I don't know that we have time to explore in depth, is where did the standard that the Nuremberg Tribunal applies come from? Because it clearly was not what was going on even in any of the Allied countries as a general rule. And the answer is that the tribunal went to the American Medical Association and had two American experts advising them, one of whom, Andrew Ivy, goes back to the AMA and asks them to approve a set of principles which are later embodied in the code, which they do, and which sound good, but which clearly don't reflect the standard of care in American research settings to that point in time. So when the Nazi doctors complained that they were being judged unfairly because the standard applied to them was applied to nobody else, there was a grain of truth in their complaint. On the other hand, nobody else was chopping off limbs and trying to reattach them or throwing people into vats of salt water, cold salt water, and measuring how long it took them to freeze to death. So there was something above and beyond what was going on anywhere else in the world. But it was a matter of degree and not kind, because most other medical researchers weren't obtaining consent from subjects either at that point in time. Nuremberg's impact is interesting to reflect on because it's impossible to hear a lecture about research ethics or read a book about it without Nuremberg playing a central role. And yet its practical impact was exceedingly limited. It got several of the Nazi doctors executed and others into prison. It made a statement to the world, but this standard was largely an aspirational standard. And here in the United States, as in other Western countries, it tended to be discounted by physicians who were conducting medical research on the grounds that, look, those kinds of practices, what was going on there, that was research on prisoners in death camps. That has nothing to do with us. We're not Nazis. We're trying to help people. And so this whole business of getting consent and voluntary consent being essential, I mean, that's true, but it's true in prisons and death camps, not in our hospitals where we're just doing this stuff to try to help people. And it's clear that studies without patients' knowledge or consent in medical settings continue into the 1960s. Because of the deficiencies of Nuremberg, the World Medical Association in 1964 convenes in Helsinki and develops a document called the Declaration of Helsinki, which exists to this day but has been repeatedly updated and revised. But you can go online to the World Medical Association website and read the declaration. In its original form, it had an interesting reaction to Nuremberg. It said consent was absolutely required for non-therapeutic clinical research. So if I want to observe whether you can get gangrene, if I make a cut in your leg and rub dirt into it, then I need your consent. But if I'm conducting clinical research combined with patient care, and I, as a physician, determine that consent is not in your best interest, by whatever standard I would make that judgment, then I don't have to obtain your consent. Now, in the 1960s, a number of things come together that lead to a change, and a change that's with us to this day. There were, in the United States, a number of very high-profile scandals, newspaper exposés of, do you remember newspapers, by the way? Anybody? Exposés of studies in which people were exposed to harm without their knowledge or consent. For example, in the city of New York, in a hospital that doesn't exist anymore, it was called the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn. Elderly, somewhat demented patients were injected with cancer cells in an effort to learn something about how the body rejected cancer cells, recognized them as foreign. When that hits the news, you can understand how people reacted adversely to that. Moreover, in 1966, Henry Beecher, the descendant of the famed Beecher family, publishes an article in the New England Journal of Medicine. Henry Beecher is the chair of anesthesiology at Mass General in Boston at that point, and one of the leading, by definition, one of the leading anesthesiologists in the country. And he publishes an article in the New England Journal, the country's leading medical journal, in which he gives short paragraph-long descriptions of 22 published articles which he thinks constitute unethical research. And many of them are examples of research being conducted without patients' consent or research that's highly likely to be harmful to patients. Most of this is clinical research. Interestingly, Beecher's article causes a big stir. It's a real classic. You should read it if you haven't yet. But if you go back to the original article, what you'll see is that there are no references. There's no citation to these published studies. Now, with very little work, even in the pre-Google era, you could have figured out whose studies these were, and one of them was the Willowbrook Study on Staten Island, in which people with mental retardation who were hospitalized at Willowbrook were exposed, deliberately inoculated with hepatitis virus in an effort, a successful effort, to develop a hepatitis vaccine. But the editors of the New England Journal thought that it would be ungentlemanly for one physician to directly criticize other physicians for unethical behavior by making their identities public. All of this culminates in 1972 with the disclosures of the Tuskegee study. You all know about Tuskegee, a cohort of black men in Alabama in 1932 who are recruited, identified as having syphilis, recruited to a study, and then followed to see what would happen, what the natural history of syphilis would be. There was no great treatment for syphilis in 1932, although arsenicals, the magic bullet, Ehrlich's magic bullet, existed already. They had a 50-50 chance of killing you or curing you, so not everybody was willing to take the treatment. But of course, by World War II, we had penicillin. And after World War II, penicillin was widely available. And nobody told these men that they had syphilis, and nobody told them that it could be treated. And in fact, active efforts were made in the early 1940s to keep them out of the Army because they would have a Wassermann test, they would be diagnosed as having syphilis, and they would be treated, and that would ruin the study. So it's a pretty horrible thing. A whistleblower finally brings it to public attention in the early 1970s. And finally, with this buildup, Congress in 1974 enacts the National Research Act, which sets up a commission to make recommendations about regulating human subjects research. Now to Joel's question. At the same time, beginning in the mid-1950s, the notion that patients should be asked for their consent to treatment, not to research, begins to arise in American courts. Not in the American medical profession, interestingly, but in American courts. The first case is in 1955, Stanford, Salgo versus Leland Stanford Hospital out in California. The sort of landmark case in 1959 is Natanson versus Klein from the Supreme Court of Kansas. And by the early 1970s, there's a triad of cases in 1971 that really shape informed consent law to this day. Disclosure in clinical settings is required. There's some discussion about what standard disclosure has to live up to, but it is possible to sue doctors who don't disclose the risks and benefits of the treatments that they're recommending or the alternatives, and consent forms begin to be developed in clinical contexts as well. So put it all together, and that leads up to the promulgation in 1981 of federal regulations that have their precursors in some earlier regs from the 70s that are developed by the Department of Health and Human Services that require for the first time for all federally funded research the consent of human subjects, which can be waived but only in limited circumstances, allow for the possibility of surrogate consent, mandate written consent as the general rule with the possibility of opting out, and require, and this is the biggest innovation of all, in many ways, prospective review of research protocols before implementation by what was called an Institutional Review Board, or IRB. And other countries, when they adopt this model, which most of the developed world has now, refer to these committees as RECs, or Research Ethics Committees, or something similar. IRBs are required. These are excerpts from the federal regs, but you can sort of focus on the red highlights. The following conditions be met in order for protocols to be approved: that risks to subjects are minimized, that they're reasonable in relation to the anticipated benefits, if any, that subjects are selected equitably, that informed consent will be sought and appropriately documented, that if necessary, a plan for monitoring the safety of subjects should be created and implemented, and that there are adequate protections of the privacy of subjects as well. Those are the core requirements for IRB approval to this day. If you're interested in looking at this in somewhat more detail, Google Common Rule, because the federal regulations go by the name of the Common Rule, and it will come right up on at the top of your Google search. If you're going to obtain informed consent, which most researchers have to do, the federal regulations require an explanation of the purposes of the research, the procedures that will be followed, risks or discomforts, benefits, appropriate alternatives, including the alternative of treatment outside of research, a statement about the confidentiality of the research records, whether any compensation will be provided, and who could be contacted if subjects have questions, and then a clear statement that participation is voluntary. There are some optional provisions which can be included, which I haven't mentioned here, depending on the nature of the study. But that's the framework, that we essentially have today, and that's how we got there, through a series of scandals and missteps by medical researchers that persuaded the public that without prospective review and tight regulation, the public would not be safe in the hands of medical researchers. And given the history of the field, the sad history, it's a little hard to argue that was not correct. Let me pause for a second here. This is the historical part of the talk. I'm going to move now to talk a little bit about where we may be going. some hot issues and the direction in which the field may be evolving. But let's see if you've got questions or comments.
Yeah, I have more philosophical, psychological question. What was the explanation given by the doctors during the trials as to why they conducted research knowing that it would have such a detrimental effect?
Yeah, the transcripts of the trials, which are published, are actually sort of interesting to read. They made a number of arguments in their defense. One was we're only following orders. A second was these people were going to die anyway. It wasn't because of us that they were going to die. They were in the death camps. They were going to die. And so to benefit humankind, we decided to do these experiments because they were going to die anyway. And why waste their lives when their deaths could actually contribute to the advancement of human knowledge? And there were appeals to the importance of the work that had been done, which pretty uniformly today is generally agreed to have been worthless. And there's some arguments about rare exceptions, but by and large, the studies were worthless. But those were the essence of the defense claims. Yeah.
Did they use any of the Tuskegee ideas in their defense? Because Tuskegee started, didn't it, before Nuremberg, well before Nuremberg?
Tuskegee starts in 1932, but nobody knows about it. It's a well-kept secret until late 1971, and then it really doesn't break until 72. So they had no idea of that, but they did argue in their defense that they were being held to a standard that nobody else was being held to. That in the United States, in England, in France before the war, nobody got consent from patients prior to doing research. And as I say, there was some validity to the argument, but it's also true that much of what they did looked more like torture than it looked like genuine medical research. If you're interested, Miriam, I can suggest some books that are really good explorations of the whole set of issues that were involved in the trials. I thought I saw another hand, no? Okay, so let's push on. And what I thought I would do would be to just highlight, there are many other issues we could talk about, and you may want to raise them, 3 issues that I think are now in play in the world of research ethics. The questions related to the effectiveness of consent and the prevalence of therapeutic misconception, whether prospective review of research, which has been in place for 40 years now, is going to continue indefinitely into the future, or whether alternative mechanisms may be developed, at least for some research, and then the role of consent in comparative effectiveness research. So Bob referred earlier to this concept of a therapeutic misconception, and I just want to define it for you here. A therapeutic misconception is a phenomenon that we see in research subjects who fail after disclosure and a consent process to grasp the difference between what goes on in clinical research and what goes on in ordinary treatment, and they tend to inaccurately attribute the aspects, the characteristics of ordinary treatment to the research setting, particularly therapeutic intent. That is to say, they think that entering a research study is for the purpose of getting the best possible treatment as opposed to advancing knowledge. So I'll show you some data from a study we did almost 15 years ago now, which is the largest one that's been done to date, looking at therapeutic misconception. And we defined it along 2 dimensions: an incorrect belief that your treatment would be individualized to what you needed, and an unreasonable belief about the nature or likelihood that you would benefit from being in the study. And what we found was that almost 2/3 of research subjects manifested a serious misconception as to one or both of these after going through the consent process. This difficulty with informed consent and the general problems that research subjects have in understanding what's communicated to them has led to a variety of efforts to improve understanding. Videotape disclosures, multimedia kinds of interactive computer programs to get consent, user-friendly consent forms. There are consent forms being used today in medical research studies, multi-site medical research studies that are more than 30 pages, single-spaced pages in length, that are written in almost effectively impenetrable combinations of medical and legal jargon that nobody reads. And we all know that nobody reads them because nobody's going to sit down and read 30 single-spaced pages. They won't even read 20 or 10 single-spaced pages. And yet we continue to produce these forms and to obtain patients' consent on these forms, which actually more accurately means obtaining research subjects' signatures on the forms. So some people have tried making them a little more user-friendly, streamlining them, et cetera. People have tried interacting repetitively with subjects, testing them afterwards, and then giving them feedback to try to correct the incorrect perceptions that they have, or some combinations of these approaches. Florian Emanuel, who did a review of the literature a decade ago, suggested that the most promising interventions were those that involved human interaction with research subjects. So more so than video or computer-aided disclosure, which had variable results, sitting somebody down in front of another human being and giving them a chance to ask questions and to hear responses and have that person teach them what they need to know was the most effective, but when you think about it, also the least likely to be implemented on a widespread scale, because it's the most expensive intervention, and it requires scarce time of expensive personnel. So where is this likely to go now? We are seeing movement towards not so much more interaction with human beings, but towards more of these interventions of what I've called variable impact down here. Lots of IRBs now they're not simplifying their consent forms, which they should be, but at the very least, they're requiring investigators to have one-page summaries that begin the consent forms as a way of giving research subjects some prayer of actually understanding what's going on here. That's a step in the right direction. It just doesn't go, in my view, quite far enough, but it's not a bad thing in its own right. There's a lot of effort being put in now to video and computer-aided disclosure. Some colleagues and I wrote a paper a year or two ago arguing that computers give us the opportunity now to individualize disclosure for research subjects. That is, you could produce a readable consent screen or a series of screens with hyperlinks and let people click on anything they wanted to know more about and go back and reread anything they were confused about. And at the end, ask questions about anything that they still didn't have down in a way that would really produce something much closer to individualized disclosure. And there are experimental models of this, but it's not being done anywhere on a widespread basis. There are even some proprietary companies that are trying to do this and sell it, but it has not yet caught on. along with a colleague I've worked with for a long time, Chuck Lids, who was my colleague. We were colleagues on the original Therapeutic Misconception study in the early 1980s. Chuck is the PI on a grant that we have from NIH, which should be starting soon, to look at another approach, which is an attempt to reframe the way research participants think about what they're getting into. That is, it's our belief that many patients enter clinical research, become research subjects, but retain a therapeutic mindset, a clinical approach to the whole setting. And we've always thought that if we tell them explicitly, just explain to them the nature of an experimental approach to testing hypotheses and the reasons that things in research are done differently than treatment, like your doctor won't know what medication you're getting, and neither will you. Why do we do that? We're not going to pick which treatment you get. There's a computer that's going to spew out a number at random that's going to tell us what your treatment is. Why do we do that? Some people are going to get an active treatment, and others are going to get a placebo, an inactive compound. Why do we do that? To attempt to explain that concisely to subjects, we think, stands a shot at breaking through some of the barriers to understanding of what it means to be in a research study. And we now have an R21 grant to try to figure that out. That says 3, but it should say 2 if you've been counting. This is the second issue that I want to just talk about with you briefly. And this is the question of what the future of our IRB model is likely to be. Today, IRBs engage in an expensive and time-consuming process of review of research protocols without a lot of evidence suggesting great benefit from the process. So almost all research in the US today is subject to prospective review by IRBs. IRB staff are now professionalized. They become certified IRB professionals. Large medical centers have multiple IRBs. At the medical center, we have 3 general IRBs and 2 specialty IRBs. And there's another IRB for this campus as well. So there are 6 IRBs altogether overseeing research at Columbia. Accreditation standards have been developed, and it costs a lot of money. So in 2003, the cost of a high-volume IRB was estimated at over $750,000. Today, that number is probably twice as much. And that doesn't count everybody's time involved in negotiating the IRB process. Since that time, new compliance requirements have been added, new training requirements have been added. It's a much more expensive process today. The average duration of review is about 3 months, which is a little horrifying. And multi-site studies typically require review at each of the sites. You could have more than 40 sites in your study. You could have more than 70 sites in your study. In general, each one of them has to review the research. There's a lot of delay, a lot of cost, a lot of concern about, particularly in the social sciences, about censorship of research studies, limiting the questions that can be asked. And we know from a number of studies, including studies we've done, that the majority of IRB effort is spent reviewing consent forms. The least useful aspect of the process soaks up the most effort. One study found 91% of requests for changes to protocols were for changes to the wording of the consent forms, which nobody reads. It's a little secret. And investigators, as a result, have also learned that they ought to put a lot of effort into writing their forms and maybe less effort into making sure their subjects understand what the studies are about, because nobody goes back to look at whether or not the subjects understand. All they look at are the forms. The forms have gotten longer and longer. I'm not going to read you the numbers, but take that as a generalization. And the question is, what can we do about it? Well, there are some things that are being tested and implemented now that I'm not going to talk about in detail, including the use of central IRBs, one IRB that can review a protocol for a multi-site study to eliminate the need for 40 IRBs to do the same thing iteratively. But 2 years ago now, HHS issued in the Federal Register something called an Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, in which they put out for public comment a number of changes to the way research regulation takes place, because they know nobody's happy with it, and they're not particularly happy with it either. And one of the things they proposed, which Bob Klisman and I wrote about in a piece in Science last year, a little commentary in Science, is a model of regulation of minimal risk studies that gets away from prospective review. They propose that for many minimal risk studies, investigators could just register the study and go right to it. And that the IRBs would selectively pull out certain studies to review more closely in a retrospective fashion without needing to review them all. Because most people think there's not much gain from all the effort that goes into review of minimal risk research. The clear advantages would be greater efficiency. You're only reviewing a small portion of the studies. You'd be reviewing what actually happens, not what's proposed. That is, you could go back and ask how well the protocols were implemented. Did subjects actually understand what they were told, as opposed to would they be likely to understand? And you could build into a retrospective review process a mechanism for appellate review, which doesn't exist now. Right now, IRBs are the court of last resort. They say no. Your only alternative is to go right back to that same IRB and ask again, maybe more nicely this time. So there's a great deal of sentiment building for rethinking IRBs. A couple of hands, yeah. Disappeared. Yeah, so the question is focused on what's happened in the last 2 years with that advance notice of proposed rulemaking, which is nothing. There was a public comment period, and we've heard nothing from HHS since that point in time. Why? I don't know for sure, and HHS isn't talking about this. My guess is that this is a sensitive area. Whatever you do here, somebody's going to object to it. And the pressure to move forward may have lessened with some personnel changes in the federal government. Zeke Emanuel, who was sort of driving this process, left the government and is at Penn now. And there's just nobody who's willing to spend the political capital it would take to make these changes. I was on a committee for SACHARP, which is the Secretary's Advisory Committee for Human Research Protections, in which we came up with proposals for changing the way research is done with people with impaired decision-making capacity. And we made a report, this is probably 4 years ago now, which has sat on a shelf ever since. But the staff from OHRP, the Office of Human Research Protections, was very clear that they thought changing the common rule was nearly impossible. It was a process that would take 10 years at a minimum to get all the agencies sign off and reviewed by the Office of the Budget and et cetera. And they were essentially in helpless, hopeless mode about any changes. So, I mean, there you go. It just hasn't moved. There was another hand. Yeah.
I'm just visiting this group here. I sit on RECs in Canada, in Montreal, too. And they do have expedited approval on the nothing that's risky. And after the fact, there's adverse reporting, adverse events. So there is a follow-up and a reporting requirement. I don't know if there's not a court to appeal it, as I know. But you have to keep following it to see if anything went awry.
Right. So procedures are similar here in the United States in both respects. There is an option for expedited review in the regs, but our IRB, for example, likes to say, just because review is expedited doesn't mean it's going to be faster. It means that it doesn't have to go to the full IRB. There's one person who's designated to review it, or sometimes a small group. But it tends to take a very long period of time, and it's limited to specific categories defined in the regs, which doesn't include all minimal risk research, but only these defined categories of research. Similarly, adverse events have to be reported because safety is a concern. But, for example, the effectiveness of your consent process doesn't have to be monitored or reported in general, unless the IRB requires that specifically, which it usually does not. But did you have another piece to that?
First, when I sit on the board, we talk about randomized testing. We all go, that's just something you can't articulate. There's something wrong with randomized clinical trials. And now it's sort of it's changing, and that the research doctors are trying to do personalized trials. I don't know, which leads me to another.
Yeah, so one of the hot areas is so-called N-of-1 trials, where you're focused on the needs of an individual patient. It's often linked to genomic sequencing and targeted medication interventions, et cetera.
Ethical terms.
Right. So let me push on ahead and just quickly talk about the real third point here. And that's the role of consent in comparative effectiveness research. There's a group at Johns Hopkins, Ruth Faden, Nancy Cass, and others, Tom Beecham, who interestingly have proposed thinking about consent differently in what they call, based on a report from the Institute of Medicine a couple of years ago, a learning health system. The notion is that our healthcare systems should always be learning from the experience of treating patients. That means routinely collecting and analyzing data. It also means routinely comparing different ways of doing things to know which one works better. And that's so essential a function of a learning health system that we should not need to ask patients for their consent, because in their view, in such kinds of research, there's not a distinction between research and treatment, even if people are randomized to two ways of, you had surgery, you're going to be in bed for 2 days, and you're going to be in bed for 4 days, but we're not going to give you a choice, and we're not going to tell you that you were randomized, because we just need to know whether 2 days or 4 days is a better way of doing it. So unless there's a negative effect on expected clinical outcomes or other outcomes or values that matter morally to patients, we don't have to bother getting their consent. That quote is from an article published last week in the New England Journal of Medicine, which had a response from two folks who I know at NIH who aren't quite so ready to walk away from the consent model. But learning health systems are a big buzzword these days, and part of the reaction to the difficulty of moving things through IRBs and getting consent from lots of subjects has been to say, let's reconceptualize the whole thing and just carve out a big area where we're not even going to follow the usual rules of consent. We're just going to include people, we're going to get their data, and we're going to do it because everybody will benefit from it. So it's a greater good argument. It's a real utilitarian argument, but it ignores really 40 years of thought now about the importance of individual consent and individual autonomy in deciding whether or not you want to be part of a research study. And there are all kinds of questions which I'm not going to go into now, and that brings us to your remaining questions and comments. Joel?
So just on that last proposal, it seems to me that a country that had an integrated national health system could be doing that. And do we know of is any nation actually trying to use their public health service data to create a learning system?
So I think the answer is yes, and the Scandinavian countries are a model of that. Everybody has a, as they say, sperm-to-worm health record that contains all of their medical information. We only aspire to such things in the United States. And there are excellent population registries of other sorts of things as well, from accidental deaths to suicide deaths to substance use, et cetera. And some of the best public health research in the world comes out of Scandinavia because they've devoted decades to building these kinds of record systems. Even the National Health Service in England, in Great Britain, is ahead of us in terms of these kinds of efforts.
Yeah.
So even though it seems apparent that in the context of the decision making before somebody enters a research study that the consent isn't always useful, what are the court's views on how useful the consent is? Like, is there a big difference between what happens in clinical practice versus what happens when there's a mistake?
So the most interesting thing to my mind in the litigation over harms that relate to participation in research is how little there is of it. In 1987, some colleagues and I wrote a book on informed consent, part of which addressed consent to research, and at that point we went through the case law to find what the precedents were. And there were no precedents. Well, we're a few years later now, 27 years later, and there are precedents, but there aren't very many. And you could easily summarize them in one paper. There hasn't been a lot of litigation. So why hasn't there been a lot of litigation? You could say in part the system may have worked. There aren't a lot of injuries that occur as a result of negligence in medical research. It may also be that the system's sort of impenetrable, and until recently we didn't have attorneys who specialized in bringing such cases. I now know of 2 in the country whose practice is sort of basically limited to suing researchers. And I've been involved in a number of such suits over the years, both for plaintiffs and defendants. But to get more directly to your question, do the courts take consent seriously, and how do they deal with the consent forms in these cases? I would say they deal with the consent forms the same way they do with consent to clinical treatment. That is, there tends to be an assumption that if it was on the form, the person read it and understood it if their signature is at the bottom of the form. So there's a protective effect in law, even if in reality we all know that the person really hasn't understood what they've read. And that contributes to just doing more of the same, making them longer and putting more information in them, because someday you may want a defense lawyer waving it in front of a jury on your behalf and saying, Mrs. Smith signed this form. How can she tell you now that she never knew that we were going to be taking out half a lobe of her brain? It says so right in the form. look, it's on page 16 in the 4th paragraph. So that tends to be how it plays out. Okay.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr.